August 10 through 15, 1993, was a watershed moment for American Catholicism. At that point, only 2 Catholic popes had ever visited the United States of America. In 1965, Pope Paul VI attended a meeting of the United Nations General Assembly in New York City. He was in the country for 14 hours and never left Manhattan. Pope John Paul II started off his pontificate by traveling more than any other pope in history. As he crisscrossed the globe, he stopped through the United States 3 times. Once to refuel his plane in Fairbanks, Alaska, on his way to Korea. And twice to barnstorm across American cities from Boston to Los Angeles, meeting with President Reagan along the way. But what happened in Colorado in 1993 was on a whole new level. On August 10, Pope John Paul II arrived in Denver for World Youth Day. He was greeted at the airport by President Bill Clinton, who landed first in Air Force One, and then waited for the Pope to arrive. Clinton welcomed the Holy Father, and they welcomed the crowd together, the president beaming alongside a pope who seemed more popular than he was. The next few days were a whirlwind. John Paul II led us Stations of the Cross march through the downtown skyscrapers. He was greeted like a rock star at Mile High Stadium, with more enthusiasm than John Elway and the Broncos typically got on that field on Sundays. And he topped off the visit with the World Youth Day Mass. Nearly 1 million young people gathered at Cherry Creek State Park on the edge of the city for an event that many American Catholics still remember as one of the most inspiring moments of their lives. So, how did Catholicism get from a system of missionary outposts on the edges of North America to becoming a marginalized minority religion in 1776? Only one signer of the Declaration of Independence was Catholic. Through being feared and persecuted up to the Civil War, and then becoming a religion of immigrants at Ellis Island, all the way to having a Polish pope being given the royal treatment by a Southern Baptist president and celebrating Mass for 1 million young people in the middle of the continent. That journey, from the first missionary contacts with Native Americans to that day in Denver, is the story of American Catholicism. It's the story of millions of individual pilgrim lives and a collective pilgrimage for the Catholic Church. And it's the story that we're going to discover together over the next 9 episodes. And in our 10th episode, we'll start with that day in Denver and ask what happened after that and where the Catholic Church in America might be going next. From the beginning, the Catholic Church has been on a missionary journey across 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, with pilgrims from every race, language, and nation. But these stories, these are American pilgrimages. There's no one story of how Catholicism came to the United States. Many missionaries from several nations in the Old World brought it to a diverse set of peoples in the New World and at various times and places. Now, most of those missionaries were honestly motivated to obey Jesus' great commission to take the gospel to all nations, baptizing and making disciples. And no one can seriously look at how they sacrifice themselves and not be humbled by their faithfulness. I'm here in the Cathedral of St. Andrew in Grand Rapids, Michigan. This magnificent church represents the best of American Catholicism. It preserves ancient tradition and it celebrates the uniquely American saints on its walls. And two of them are part of this episode. Catholicism reached the area that eventually became the United States more than 2 centuries before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And the first contact between the church and Native Americans came through missionaries that were associated with military or trade expeditions. So, before we go any further, we need to talk about the role that Catholicism played in European colonialism of the Americas. Now, the reasons why European governments funded military and trade expeditions, I think is rather obvious. They saw the opportunity to expand their territory, to seize and produce wealth, and to build and protect their empires. Frankly, that's what kings and emperors have done with their armies on every continent since the dawn of recorded history, whether it was the Egyptians or the Babylonians, the Mongols or the Islamic caliphates, or the Incas or the Aztecs. Empires have always arisen to rule over vast regions of subject peoples. So, when the European nations, who at that point were frankly exhausted from fighting Islamic armies to basically a draw in North Africa and the Middle East for centuries, when they discovered new continents across the Atlantic, it was inevitable that the quest for empire would flow westward. But what about the Catholic Church? Was the church trying to build an empire? Was the church colonialist? Well, that depends on what you think of Christianity in general. In the Great Commission, Matthew chapter 28:20, Jesus commanded his followers to go and make disciples in all nations, baptizing in his name and teaching them to obey everything that he commanded. For Jesus was the Lord of all creation, and he would be with his church to the ends of the earth. Now, if you reject or are offended by Christianity's claim to have a universal Lord with a universal gospel, offering salvation to the whole world, then you're going to be offended by the missionary impulse of the Catholic Church, and you're going to see it as nothing but a colonial ideology. But if you accept the basic premise that the church's purpose is to go into all nations, baptizing and making disciples, then the church's desire to send missionaries to the Americas makes perfect sense. How could they not? Look, this series is about how Catholicism spread in the Americas, not whether it should have in the first place. So, I'm going to take it for granted that when the church discovered that there were whole continents of souls who didn't know Christ, well, it was only natural and frankly the correct impulse from their perspective to send missionaries. But did those first missionaries coerce converts rather than persuade them? You know, it seems mighty suspicious, some think, that they arrived in ships full of armed men, isn't it? Well, yes and no. I mean, how else were they going to get across the ocean? The Catholic Church didn't have a fleet of ships for its missionaries. Most of them, we'll see, were from religious orders like the Franciscans and the Jesuits. They hitched rides on military or commercial expeditions. And yes, the people who funded those expeditions expected the expeditions to turn a profit. Now, were there some bad missionaries who took the opportunity to exploit their position for personal gain? Sure there were. Just like there are bad doctors, bad college professors, bad soldiers, and, well, bad congressmen. But one cannot look knowledgeably and seriously at the really harsh lives of the Franciscan and Jesuit missionaries who sacrificed everything to face danger, deprivation, and death so that they could baptize converts. One cannot look at that and think that they weren't sincerely motivated to share Christ. Even if you disagree with their motives, it's hard to question them. There are no better examples of the Great Commission than the first Catholic missionaries who gave their lives to bring Christ to these shores. And as soon as those first Catholic missionaries' feet touched the soil that would eventually become the United States, they began planting seeds. Now, they didn't follow a strategy of forced conversions among the most powerful of the Native American nations. Instead, they built relationships from the ground up with any native peoples that they met. And that, well, it produced some very unlikely converts, one of whom we'll meet at the end of this episode.
The Cathedral of St. Andrew is a magnificent example of American Catholicism. And so, naturally, it has a shrine to Our Lady of Guadalupe, because she is the patron saint of the Americas, and she's the key to understanding the early missionary work of the Catholic Church on this continent.
Every Catholic, and probably anyone living in the Americas, has seen some version of this image, Our Lady of Guadalupe, the patron saint of the Americas. But perhaps not everyone that has seen it realizes that this represents the very definition of a miraculous icon. In 1531, only a decade after the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs in what is now Mexico City, an Aztec man named Juan Diego was walking on a hill outside the city when a miraculous woman appeared to him. She told him to go to speak to the Catholic bishop and tell him to build a church on that spot. Juan Diego had a hard time getting an appointment with the bishop, and when he did, the bishop was understandably skeptical. Juan Diego went back to the spot on the hill, and this time the lady told him to gather some roses that were growing there into his cloak and take them to the bishop. He did as he was told. When he got in front of the bishop again, he opened his cloak to release the bundle of roses. When he did, the bishop and his assistants fell down in awe. For an icon of the Virgin Mary, called Our Lady of Guadalupe, had been miraculously imprinted on his cloak. The story is astounding, and the details are amazing. You can find them easily, and I'll post a couple of links to some resources. The icon of Our Lady of Guadalupe is one of the handful, and when I say handful, I mean like less than 10 Vatican-endorsed miraculous icons in the whole one whirling adventure that has been the Catholic story for 2,000 years. Like the crucifix of San Damiano, it reminds us that God will appear and speak to us at the times and places of His own choosing, not ours. And here's another fascinating aspect of this icon. On October 7, 1571, the flagship of the Holy League's Armada carried a reproduction of the icon of Our Lady of Guadalupe that had been touched to the original in Mexico City, into the great naval battle at Lepanto. The Pope, Pius V, partially attributed the West's victory to the power of this icon, and the celebration of the victory at Lepanto, over time, has become the Feast of Our Lady of the Rosary. But that's another story for another episode.
What's the significance of this Marian apparition, Our Lady of Guadalupe, to the story of Catholicism in the United States? After all, she appeared in what is now Mexico City. But Our Lady of Guadalupe matters to all Catholics throughout the Western Hemisphere. In 1754, Pope Benedict XIV issued a papal bull declaring her the patroness of New Spain, which at the time included large tracts of North American territory, part of which would eventually become the United States. Other popes through the 19th and early 20th centuries continued to venerate her and grant her ecclesiastical honors and titles. For example, in 1946, Pope Pius XII declared her patroness of the Americas. And in 1961, Pope John XXIII invoked her as the Mother of the Americas, mother and teacher of the faith for all American peoples. Pope John Paul II visited her shrine twice, in 1979 and in 1990, and he reiterated her title as the patroness of the Americas. So, while the people of Mexico do indeed have a special bond and devotion to her, Our Lady of Guadalupe is the mother and teacher of the Catholic faith for all Americans, North, South, and Central. And every Catholic in the United States ought to venerate her and ask for her intercession. Now, Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared to St. Juan Diego in 1531, The first Catholic mission within what would become the United States, which we'll learn about in our next segment, wasn't established for another 18 years. So, the apparition of the Blessed Mother to Juan Diego on that hill prefigured and blessed the conversion of the Americas. She gave courage and consolation to the missionaries who would bring the gospel to lands that were, well, very far and very different from their homes. She showed that, as they made their first contacts around the peripheries of the future United States, that she went ahead of and with them, and that she would bless their efforts to share the gospel, make disciples, and establish the church. There's another reason that Our Lady of Guadalupe matters to the story of American Catholicism, and it's one which ought to comfort faithful Catholics, but which will never satisfy its critics. She appeared to Juan Diego only 10 years after the Aztec Empire fell to the Spanish. At that point, Catholic missionaries had made, very little progress with the native population in the former Aztec Empire. But when she appeared in the guise of a young Aztec woman, with visual aspects that reconciled Catholic and Native American cultures, she signified that the peoples of the Americas would be welcomed into the body of Christ, and that they would enrich and contribute to the global Catholic Church. After she appeared to Juan Diego, the people of Mexico began converting in droves. And soon after, other missionaries would make landfall in the future United States under her blessing and protection. So, the story of the church in the United States begins, really, in Mexico City, when Our Lady threw her mantle across these continents, indicating that she would become the mother to all American Catholics, past, present, and future. In 1549, a Dominican priest named Luis de Cancher left the Spanish outpost in Havana, Cuba, for Florida. At that point, the Spanish had been in the Caribbean for 70 years and had already established colonies throughout South and Central America and Mexico, and had begun exploring up the Gulf Coast. Father Cancher had already been working as a missionary in the Caribbean and Guatemala. He strongly objected to the harsh treatment and exploitation of the Native Americans that he saw within the new Spanish colonies. Cancher believed in a nonviolent approach to winning the trust of the native peoples in order to share the gospel with them through friendship and peaceful persuasion. But by this time, several expeditions of conquistadors, adventurers, and mercenaries had already landed along Florida's Gulf Coast, armed to the teeth and ravaging the local peoples. They had turned the Florida tribes hostile toward all the Spanish. So, Father Cancher petitioned the King of Spain for permission to send a non-violent Christian mission for the purposes of evangelization only, without a military escort. Now, the king gave his blessing as long as the missionaries avoided the areas where the conquistadors had made such a mess of it. So, in 1549, just 18 years after the appearance of Our Lady of Guadalupe, Father Cancher and 4 other Dominicans, with a converted Florida native as an interpreter, departed on a merchant ship for the area that we now know as the Florida Panhandle. But they didn't make it that far. The merchant captain dumped them off in Tampa Bay, just a few miles away from where the conquistadors had stirred up the hornet's nest. Their interpreter convinced the missionaries to visit a local village, and they set out to the village without Cancher, who was to meet them the next day. But the next day, Father Cancher learned that his brother friars had been killed by a local war chief. The merchant captain begged Father Cancher to get back on the ship, but he would not leave the land that had been stained by martyrs' blood. As the local war band approached, he knelt on the beach, praying as he was killed. Father Cancher's little expedition was the first formal missionary contact with the peoples of what would become the United States. It was a genuine attempt at peaceful evangelization by those missionaries willing to accept martyrdom for the gospel. But unfortunately, it was unsuccessful in making any actual converts. It was another 16 years before the first successful Catholic mission to America was established. On September 8, 1565, 5 ships under the command of a Spanish general sailed into a small cove near what is now St. Augustine, Florida, on the Atlantic coast just south of Jacksonville. They had been sent to the New World by King Philip II with the mission of establishing a colony along the Florida coast, securing the territory for Spain, and, what at least some of the members of the expedition considered most important, converting the Native Americans to Christianity. Many people today have a cynical reaction to those instructions. Skeptics and critics assume that converting the natives to Christianity was just a pretense for colonization and control. But by all accounts, while King Philip was an imperialist, he was also a sincere Catholic who genuinely desired to see these new peoples brought into the church. And the missionaries on these ships took their work very seriously. One of the missionaries recorded what happened that day in his diary. On Saturday the 8th, the general landed with many banners spread, to the sounds of trumpets and the salutes of artillery. As I had gone ashore the evening before, I took a cross and went to meet him, singing the hymn Te Deum Laudamus. The general, followed by all who accompanied him, marched to the cross, knelt, and kissed it. A large number of Indians watched these proceedings and imitated all that they saw done. The missionaries venerated the crucifix and proclaimed the location a sacred space, calling it the Mission of Nombre de Dios, the name of God. The lead priest celebrated the Mass on a rustic wooden altar with the sky as a roof, and thus it became the first parish Mass celebrated anywhere in what is now the United States. The Jesuits and later the Franciscans ministered to the Spanish colonists and began making efforts to evangelize several native villages nearby. In one of the villages, the chief and his daughter became Christians, perhaps the first native-born American Catholics. A few years later, a devotion to Our Lady of La Leche was brought over from Spain, and the first Marian shrine in the United States was constructed. In 2019, the United States Council of Catholic Bishops elevated it to the status of a national shrine. If you're ever in St. Augustine, Florida, you can visit the National Shrine of Our Lady of La Leche at Mission Nombre de Dios, America's first parish church. In 1531, an Italian Franciscan friar named Marco de Nizza came to the Americas. He served his order in Peru, Guatemala, and Mexico, and he became the provincial superior for the Franciscans in Mexico. Now, at the time, the Spanish were hearing these rumors that there were these massive Indian cities rivaling those of the Aztecs north of the Sonoran Desert in what is now the southern United States. So, in 1539, de Nizza was sent on a series of exploratory expeditions by the Spanish governor in Mexico City. Now, the reports that he brought back were confusing and they were contradictory. He never did find any Indian metropolises or make any converts or establish any missions. But he is generally considered to be the first European to see the region that we now know as Arizona and New Mexico. But the first Catholic church established in Arizona or New Mexico was the mission Nuestra Señora de los Angeles de Porciúncula, 20 miles east of Santa Fe. It was established by Franciscan missionaries sometime around 1598. The first mission was very rustic, and it was rebuilt 20 years later by another Franciscan named Pedro Zambrano, who had been born in the Canary Islands. Now, he built it on a narrow ridge about a quarter mile from the Indian village, since the locals would not allow a Christian church within their pueblo. Now, the church was rebuilt several times over the next century, and you can visit the ruins of the 1717 version if you are ever in Santa Fe. Now, the name that the Franciscans chose for this early mission is interesting. It's the name of the massive basilica in Assisi, Italy, that was built over the small chapel, the Porciuncula, from which St. Francis launched the Franciscan order, and where he died. In fact, on our last One Whirling Adventure Lane pilgrimage to Italy, we visited the Basilica of Our Lady of the Angels of the Porciuncula, and we participated in a candlelight procession into it to pray the rosary at the original chapel of the Franciscans. If you ever come with us on a pilgrimage to Italy, I'll show it to you. So, by naming this first Catholic mission church in the southwest United States after the holiest spot in the Franciscan tradition, the missionaries transfused the lifeblood of one of the church's most beloved saints into American Catholicism. Over the next dozen years or so, the Franciscans built a chain of missions throughout New Mexico, between what is now Albuquerque in the south and Taos in the north. Like the chain of missions that the Franciscans would establish along the California coast, which we'll discuss in episode 3, they were a systemic approach to missions. They provided consistent evangelization, and they built long-term communities with the Indian converts. 20 years before the English Protestant settlement at Jamestown, Virginia, Catholicism had established a permanent presence in America. Other than the Franciscan explorer Marco de Nizza's fruitless expeditions in the mid-1500s, there were no real missionary efforts in Arizona until an Italian-born Jesuit named Eusebio Quino came to Mexico in 1681. He was the son of a minor nobleman from the Tyrolean Alps on the border between Italy and Germany. Quino was an educated man. He was accomplished in many fields like geography, cartography, and astronomy. But after recovering from a serious illness, he entered the Jesuit order to serve the Lord and was sent to Mexico, then the center of New Spain. His skills made him the perfect missionary to open up new regions. And in 1683, Father Quino was sent to lead a Jesuit expedition to the Baja Peninsula. He explored it, mapped it, and established his first mission there. But a prolonged drought in the area forced the Jesuits to abandon the site, and they returned to Mexico City. Father Quino was then sent north into the Sonoran Desert to a region the Spanish called the Pimeria Alta, which we know as southern Arizona. On March 14, 1687, 24 years and 1 day before his death, Father Quino left Curcurpe, a town that was considered the rim or the edge of Christendom. He was going unarmed, without an army, beyond the edges of European or Catholic influence to spread the gospel. Quino quickly built positive relationships with the natives. They suggested that he establish his first permanent mission in a river valley in the Sonoran Mountains. Father Quino then began to travel the ancient Indian trade routes and trails on horseback, moving extensively between native towns in Arizona, Mexico, and as far west as California. With his skills as a cartographer, he effectively mapped the region of over 50,000 square miles. In fact, many of the geographical landmarks of the area, including the Colorado River, were named by Father Quino. Father Quino's maps were so accurate that they were still in use until the late 1800s. The trade routes that he traveled on horseback eventually became the highway systems of the region. Father Quino helped to develop the region's economy, teaching the indigenous people more effective agricultural techniques and introducing them to European seeds, fruits, herbs, and grains. He taught them to raise cattle, sheep, and goats. In fact, the 20 cattle that he brought with him multiplied to 70,000 by his death, making him Arizona's first rancher. Father Quino worked with and ministered to 16 different native tribes throughout the region, building relationships of mutual respect, trade, and education. And this created opportunities for evangelization. By the time of his death, Quino had established 24 permanent Catholic missions and chapels in the region. Settlements grew up around these missions, and they established a permanent Catholic presence in the southwest United States. Father Quino is honored throughout northern Mexico and the southern United States with various towns, streets, schools, monuments, and different geographic features named after him. In 2020, Pope Francis advanced the cause of Quino's sainthood by recognizing his life of heroic virtue and declaring him venerable. Those who believe that Catholicism came to America as part of a conquering military force ignore the ministries of Father Quino, the Franciscans in New Mexico, or the French Jesuits that we'll meet in the Northeast United States. All of these missionaries sacrificed their lives, joyfully enduring hardships and danger beyond the edges of European civilization to establish Catholic missions, chapels, and schools. Catholicism's presence in this country is older, wider, and deeper than the Protestantism that grew out of the 13 English colonies along the Atlantic seaboard.
This is a statue of Saint KATERI TEKAKWITHA, known as the Lily of the Mohawks. A young Native American from what is now Quebec, she converted to Catholicism under the influence of French Jesuit missionaries. She took KATERI as a Christian name in honor of Saint Catherine of Siena, and, like her namesake, took a vow of perpetual virginity. And, like that great saint from Italy, was committed to chastity, mortification of the flesh, and a deep love for Jesus and his cross, which is why she's looking up towards the magnificent cross in the woods. She was beatified by Pope John Paul II and canonized by Pope Benedict in 2012. She's the first and only Native American saint. And now, let's discover the story behind the saint.
Catholicism's first contacts with America came through Spain, mostly through Franciscan and Jesuit missionaries. But they weren't the only Catholic missionaries arriving on these shores. On the opposite end of the continent from Father Quino, his Jesuit brothers from France were arriving in the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. In episode 2, we're going to meet these French missionaries, but this episode wouldn't be complete without mentioning a very special first contact. She was a member of the Mohawk Nation, born in what is now upstate New York in 1656, during the period that the Franciscan missions in New Mexico and the Jesuit missions of Father Quino in Arizona were being established. When she was a child, her family died in an outbreak of smallpox. She survived, but the virus left her face permanently scarred. And when she was 19, she converted to Catholicism with the Jesuits and was given the baptismal name of KATERI in honor of Saint Catherine of Siena. KATERI was especially devoted to Jesus and Mary and had no interest in taking a husband. She committed herself to a life of consecrated virginity. But this put her at odds with her village. They couldn't understand the Christian concept of voluntary celibacy, and the pressure on her to take a husband was intense. She insisted that her Lord Jesus was her chosen husband, and she wished to live for him. She did everything that she could to try to live a faithful Catholic life among her people, who just did not understand it. Ridiculed by her own people for her faith, she moved to the Jesuit mission village of Kahnawake, near Montreal. There, she became known for her piety, for her fasting, and for mortification of the flesh, just like her namesake, Catherine of Siena. The last 5 years of her life were spent in exile, shunned by her people, but interceding for them. KATERI was said to have put thorns on her sleeping mat and lain upon them while praying for her relatives' conversion and forgiveness. When she learned about women's religious orders in the Catholic Church, she asked the Jesuits for permission to form a convent. But they told her to wait, that she was too young in the faith to fully discern her vocation. So, she fasted and prayed and mortified her flesh. She had the habit of weaving these little wooden crosses and leaving them on trails in the woods near the village to encourage Catholics in the area to stop and pray. But her life was harsh, and when she was only 24 years old, her health failed. She died in the arms of her Catholic friend, Marie-Thérèse. Her final words were, "Jesus, Mary, I love you." It took 300 years for her to be beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1980. She was the fourth Native American to be venerated in the Catholic Church, but she was the first to be canonized in 2012 by Pope Benedict in St. Peter's Basilica. Now, Saint KATERI TEKAKWITHA was one of the most recent Americans to be canonized. But when we consider when she lived, she is, retroactively, the earliest American saint. And thus, she is perhaps one of the most special of the first contacts between the Catholic Church and the United States.
Catholicism came to America because brave missionaries went beyond the edges of their known world to follow Jesus' call. We have no real contemporary analogy for what they did. It was more like going to the moon than getting on a plane and going anywhere on the globe today. But I'll leave you with this question. What has happened to our missionary impulse today? I mean, if they were willing to go to the equivalent of the moon to share Christ with people that seemed alien to them, are we at least willing to speak to our own culture? And if not, why not? Join me next time for more American pilgrimages. Thank you for coming along on these American pilgrimages. I encourage you to continue growing in faith and knowledge with courses and resources from the Lakeshore Academy for the New Evangelization and One Whirling Adventure. And consider joining me sometime for a real-life pilgrimage to discover the Catholic story where it actually happened, in either the Old World or the New World.